Tuesday, July 7th, coming at you with another edition of Cape Ann Today. Heather and I kick off today with a great interview with Taylor Bradford of the Gloucester Daily Times.
So this week starts off pretty great here in Gloucester. Ben Lummis of Cambridge has signed a 3-year contract with a salary of $184,000 with the Gloucester School Committee to become the next superintendent of Gloucester Public Schools. So Ben, he's had a couple different experiences in and out of the classroom, all educational though. He started his time working as an educator and facilitator on the outdoor education program called Outward Bound out in North Carolina. But since then, he has really expanded his repertoire and worked a lot of places, specifically within urban settings, working in Boston and Cambridge. And so really trying to find ways to support students. And that seems to be his priority is communication. As I spoke with him last week, he kind of walked me through that communicating both with teachers and parents and students is his top priority as he comes into the school district here. But he's no stranger to Gloucester either. His mother actually lives here in Magnolia. So he kind of mentioned that he's come here quite a bit to visit her, had visited her last week. And so he and his wife are eager and excited to come and live and experience what Gloucester is like, as he's been here once or twice before in different facets. But so great being able to speak with him. The whole story is on our website and in the print, but you can definitely see kind of what it's been like for him as an educator, but also what does it mean for him to enter into a school district during COVID, right? A lot of people are wondering, how do you enter into any new position during this time in our country, in our local economy, and just city? And so for him, he actually has quite a bit of experience. You know, he has been able to be on different school committee boards, been a teacher, and then also looking at his time working as in the Cambridge School Committee. And so his most recent work was at Brookline. He was the interim superintendent over there, and actually was helping them navigate the pandemic and going to online remote learning. So something that a lot of our Gloucester School Committee members were eager about to see how he responds and really brings Gloucester into the next academic year, which is crazy. I would say it's honestly coming up faster than we're going to realize it. And so he's really trying to figure out ways in which he can bring the experiences that he's had over at Brookline here to Gloucester and really help elevate the students' ability to learn and experience all the different things that they need to make the next steps in their own journeys.
What vibe did you get when you're in your conversation from him, Taylor? Is he up to the challenge, it seems?
Yeah, it seems so. He's been on a lot of Zoom meetings already, and he's had to navigate. We were talking a little bit about how he's had to navigate. Brookline has had school building projects, 3, I believe. So not only the pandemic, but also all these other experiences, helping just pass different agreements and stuff like that. So he seems to have been in those, conversations that are sometimes, a little bit heated or lots of differencing of viewpoints on the matters. And so he seems pretty eager, pretty excited to get that conversations and communications going. When we chat, he was wrapping up stuff for Brookline. So I believe he's kind of entering into Gloucester this week, but he seems up for the challenge, and we'll see how he does and how the next year's pan out. So
yeah, it's baptism by fire between that and the consolidation of the elementary schools.
Right. Yeah.
Is there any sense of, I assume, so Brookline is a small city, Gloucester is a small city. Do you know how many schools are in Brookline versus Gloucester? Do you have any sense of how they compare?
I don't know. I don't have any sense of, the differencing or similarities between the school districts. I know that when we spoke, he was able to give insight of how he was able to be a part of both school committees and his experience as interim superintendent there. He felt was going to lend itself well to here. Obviously, there are both small cities. They're two very different cities. One is, by the shore, as what we would call an island, and then you have one that's a little bit more inner city. And there's definitely going to be different experiences there for him as a superintendent and just the culture that is the city. But we'll see how that pans out as we continue to go and watch school committee meetings and go into next school year.
Right.
And Taylor, you wanted to talk about kittens?
I did. Yeah. I know, Heather, where's your cat?
She's usually begging to be on my lap right here, but
The one time Bean isn't around.
no.
Right.
Yeah. What about
Well, not Heather's cat, but a Cape Ann resident, Jessica Biker, is fostering 7 kittens from Cape Ann Animal Aid, in addition to her own cat, dog, and turtle. So Leona, Chitara, Panthro, Snarf, Tigra, Pumia, and Allura are crawling around in her house right now. And Paul Bilodeau, our photographer, and I had the opportunity to go and interview her and hear a little bit about her story, because we talk about these organizations, and throughout COVID, we found that, we hear the upper level tiers of what organizations are doing, but really the people who are involved. So, thinking about the employees of Cape Ann Animal Aid, thinking about the people who adopt. But there's these middle men and women who we don't even think about necessarily right off the top of our heads, who are actually taking care of these animals in the in-between, especially as COVID's happening. They're trying to mitigate how many staff members are going into the animal shelter. And so they've kind of brought the animals to different people who are willing to foster. And so Jessica said, I'll take on 7, and this is not her first go around it. This is her 3rd time fostering since the pandemic started. She's been fostering since 2018 when she first moved here into the city. So she's talked about how they're always everywhere. They're about this big. So as we're in her facilities, these cats are everywhere, and you're afraid you're going to be stepping on them, or leaning back in a couch and realize one's behind you. One was untying Paul's shoes at one point, but it's one example of a lot of different volunteers and people in the city during the pandemic, and also trying to figure ways. Cape Ann Animal Aid has had a plethora of adoptions, and they say it really is thanks to these foster parents who are willing to make the contact with the people who are interested in adopting an animal at this point in time.
So people can still be adopting, but they're simply coming from the foster homes, these animals. Is that right?
Correct. Staying at the foster homes, but once they have been kind of checked out, they will put them online. Honestly, I've been checking the website's adoption page maybe every day, and you see different dogs and cats on there as they come, and they actually don't last more. Honestly, I've been checking it for about a month now, and the animals don't last more than 5 days. So they're going pretty rapidly on the site. So sometimes there's no animals for adoption, but that doesn't mean they're not out there. They're probably just in that process before they can be available for adoption.
Well, I have 2 wonderful cats that were recently adopted from the Cape Ann Animal Aid, so I am here to testify. So why didn't you come home with a kitten, though?
That is what all my flatmates keep asking me is, why didn't you bring a cat or dog home? But there's still time. The summer is not over, so maybe one of these interview calls will see a dog or cat running by my screen. So who knows?
Regarding that superintendent, what a tough place for any superintendent right now, but then starting in a new city and getting to know the community. And not only that, he has all these families waiting to find out what will happen in the fall. He doesn't even know these families too well. And what happens in the fall comes down to what the governor says.
This is going to be the fastest 4 to 6 weeks of his life.
Exactly. But I'm sure those families are ready to eat him alive, because everybody needs to know. And it's so important for people going back to work to find out what will happen to the school systems. So it's an important time.
It is. And I'm also friends with Jessica Biker, and it is no surprise at all that she is she is a remote CAAA location right now. So cheers to you, Jessica, and good luck to you. We also had a great conversation, or you did, Heather, with State Senator Bruce Tarr.
Yes, he had a lot to talk about. It was a busy week in the state Senate. He opened, though, by talking about this group, the United States Cadet Nurse Corps. And that sounds kind of boring. There was a memorial in the Senate for this nursing corps. But you have to remember that this organization was started in a health crisis. There was a lack of nurses. We had a real nursing shortage in this country because of World War II. First had been World War I and then World War II. And the country hustled together and they started training nurses. So there's so many parallels between what's happening today and what happened then. So I really like the fact that he opened discussing and honoring this group?
So I'm really excited about the Nurse Cadet Corps bill because my understanding is it is the first bill in the country that will place official recognition for the U.S. nurse cadets in a state capital. And so part of the bill says that, yes, we will recognize the nurse cadets on July 1st, but a second piece of the bill allows for a plaque to be placed at the State House commemorating the nurse cadets. Now, you probably know, Heather, that that wouldn't be the first time that nurses have been recognized in the State House, because Nurses Hall is dedicated originally to the nurses that served during the Civil War. So this will be the second time that nurses get an official place of recognition. But just for folks that may not be familiar with it, the Nurse Cadet Corps started during World War II. And the reason that it started was because there was a shortage of nurses in our hospitals, because many of the nurses had been deployed to help with the war effort. And so the U.S. Department of Public Health, that's probably not the right name, but the health department established this corps of cadet nurses who basically kept alive our hospitals in the United States. And there are still a number of these folks left, although like many members of the greatest generation, they are fading from our midst fairly quickly, which is one of the reasons that we wanted to do this. But we are really, really pleased to have a bipartisan bill that recognizes these nurse cadets, and the governor signed it into law. And so this July 1st was actually the first Nurse Cadet Day in the Commonwealth.
Well, I think it's just so touching also in this healthcare crisis that we're in right now for the State House to recognize these women in yet another health crisis that we have. So, so thank you for that. Now let's talk about phase 3 reopening on Monday, right?
It is. Monday we go into step 1 of phase 3, and that means a very large number of additional businesses will be able to open. There are still restrictions, so they won't be able to open as they normally would, because what accompanied the reopening order from the governor was also a new gathering order that talks about indoor and outdoor spaces. So we still have limited capacity in the businesses, but at least they can reopen. And Heather, I've got my handy list right here that I can read from of some of the things that includes, because I don't want to miss any. So interestingly enough, in step 1, which begins on the 6th of July, casino gaming floors, horse racing tracks, indoor recreational and athletic fields, fitness centers and gyms, museums, indoor historic spaces, aquariums, outdoor theaters and performance venues that aren't otherwise subject to phase 4, outdoor event space used for gatherings and celebrations, including parks, reservations, and other outdoor spaces not designated for phase 4, indoor space such as ballrooms and private party rooms for events only, indoor non-athletic instructional classes in such things as painting and pottery, some indoor recreational businesses such as batting cages, bowling alleys, driving ranges, go-karts, and rock climbing, movie and TV production. And I know you'll be happy to hear that, Heather, because I'm sure Hollywood will be calling for your next appearance, and you can sign up. Sightseeing and other organized tours, movie theaters, and post-secondary higher ed and vocational tech and occupational schools, regular operations. I'll breathe now.
Okay, thank you. What isn't opening? That's what I probably, what's it phase 4?
Well, so phase 4 involves things where there would be a lot of close gathering of people. So concerts and other kinds of indoor events where people would be clustered close together. Bars are in phase 4. Generally, those are the things that the governor and the folks that are advising the governor and the lieutenant governor don't believe should be open until we reach something called a new normal, which is where we either have therapeutic drugs that can effectively deal with COVID-19, or we can have a vaccine that prevents its transmission. So for those things, it's going to be quite a while, we think. So phase 3, I would argue, is probably one of the most significant developments that we've had during this entire pandemic, to be able to open that many more things.
Yes, and I am sure that the governor is carefully watching the rest of the country. And
You know, it's interesting. On this week's leadership call, we discussed that at length. And one of the things we discussed are the hotspots that are happening now in most of the rest of the country. And one of the things that was discussed is the fact that there is not a lot of travel happening, and particularly not a lot of travel happening on airplanes. And that may well give us a quantum of protection from folks bringing the virus here from those places that have large numbers of new cases every day. How long that will last, it's hard to say, but that is significant. It's also significant, Heather, that the governor changed the rules about asking folks to quarantine for 14 days. And so now the change is that if you are coming from a New England state, to include New York and New Jersey, so 7 states altogether, you will not be asked to quarantine for those 14 days because those states have done a good job of controlling the transmission of coronavirus, and it's believed that people coming from them don't represent a significant threat to Massachusetts residents. So it's very interesting that we're in a part of the country where there seems to be good progress being made, and yet it's discouraging that in other parts of the country that absolutely is not the case.
no, it really is disheartening, but it's great to see our state doing such a good job and the leadership there. So speaking of leadership, you had a busy week in the State House, in the Senate. Do you want to talk briefly about some action, some bills being passed?
Sure. I'm really happy that we had a very productive formal session on Thursday, and it included a lot of bills. One we've talked about before, which is the bill to govern election laws and give more flexibility. And just to refresh people's memory, there's really 2 components to that. One is increased use of mailing for voting, primarily by the use of an absentee ballot mechanism. And the second is increased time for early voting so that folks can go to the polls early and we don't have to have everyone come on election day. And that was a really good compromise effort between the House and the Senate. It was a bipartisan effort, and that bill is now on the governor's desk. So the Senate goes last in the chain of approvals, and the Senate did enact that bill on Thursday, and now we're awaiting the governor's action on it, hopefully in the very near future.
And I have to ask, because people are speculating, do you think the governor will have any issues with this bill and vote?
I don't. I would predict that the governor will sign the bill. If he doesn't sign it, I would suspect he may send it back with a few recommendations for changes, but I do not envision him vetoing the bill outright. So I think it's pretty clear we're going to get a bill of this nature. My sense is we'll probably get his outright approval, but there may be a little bit more back and forth that happens between the legislature and the administration.
Great. And we touched upon this a little bit, but it was passed in the Senate, the $1.7 billion bond bill, right?
Yes, indeed. So it was, the House had sent us a version of this bond bill because generally speaking, spending bills originate in the House. This bill came to us, it was originally filed actually by the governor. The House passed its version of it and it came to us. And without getting into a lot of the details, it's important to understand that a bond bill authorizes bonded spending. So it doesn't mean that these dollars will be immediately flowing out to their intended beneficiaries. It means that we have given the governor authorization to sell bonds, issue bonds, and use the proceeds of those bonds for the things that are contained in the bond bill. So I know that you love restaurants, and so I hope you'll love a restaurant metaphor. When we do a bond bill, it's like we are writing a menu, and the governor gets to choose what he's going to eat from that menu. And and we think we are really good cooks. So we put a number of important things in the bond bill. These are things that are primarily for capital assets that will have a lifetime of longer than 5 years. And the thing that I wanted to point out is there are some very positive things in the bond bill for Cape Ann. Now, one of them has been a joint effort. Representative Ferranti worked hard to get money in the House version of the bill. I was able to put it in the Senate version of the bill and keep it in the bill. There's about $36 million for food systems to be able to increase local production of food and do a whole host of things with regard to that, including provide additional support for our food banks and our food pantries for things like refrigerated storage. I was able to add in the Senate version of the bill a requirement that some of that money also be available for meat and poultry production, because one of the things that we're learning is there appears to be a tremendous opportunity for Massachusetts to increase its ability to produce meat and poultry locally. And so the Senate Working Group on Supply Chain Issues, which I chair, has spent a lot of time on this. And at first we thought, well, maybe there isn't that much of an opportunity. And what we found is that, particularly with regard to meat processing, all of the current facilities are actually oversubscribed. And there is the ability to stand up more processing and be able to generate more meat products locally. The same is also true of poultry processing. There are 3 meat processing facilities in Massachusetts, only 1 poultry processing facility. And we think that there's a very significant opportunity to be able to create more capacity.
That is so interesting, because I happen to work with a young group of local producers, local agriculture people, who talk about this often, and it has been a struggle. I know one young couple were raising meat, and it was just too hard for them to process it, so they stopped doing that. So that's super exciting. So what else is on the menu in that bond bill?
So I'm not done yet. So another thing that we've been working on for quite a while is creating innovation funds for agriculture and for fishing. And while we were trying to get a much larger amount, we know that given the circumstances we face, we may have to scale that back. So we got $1 million each for each fund, $1 million for a fishing innovation fund and $1 million for an agricultural innovation fund. And some of the things that we're looking at for that fund, which, by the way, will be guided by a group of industry stakeholders in each case, but we're looking at trying to do things that might make fishing vessels more fuel efficient, or farms more energy independent, able to generate renewable energy. We're also looking at whether there might not be some innovative farming practices that are good for the soils and good for the environment that we can undertake. I had a conversation just last weekend with a farmer from Essex about that, and how there's much more that we could be doing that's good for production, but also good for the environment. One of the things that I'm particularly keen on is trying to execute projects that conduct carbon sequestration, to take the carbon out of the atmosphere using our natural resources and try to bend the curve of global warming. And so there's a lot of promise to some of those things, so hopefully we'll fund some of those. So $1 million going in each direction, fishing and farming. We think that's very positive. And then something that's a little bit more particularized to the city of Gloucester, we anticipate that at some point in the future, and we don't know exactly when, we may be required by the federal government in Gloucester to build an upgraded or a new wastewater treatment plant. And that is a very, very daunting proposition, because it will cost millions of dollars. So in this bond bill, we appropriated, authorized $50,000 to help with the feasibility study for that and some of the design studies, just so we can get a sense of truly what we're going to need to do to be able to meet the federal requirements relative to something that's known as our NPDES permit, our National Pollution Discharge Elimination System permit.
Nice that that was on the tip of your tongue.
We have one of the few permitted remaining on the East Coast level 1 facilities, and we are likely going to be required at least to go to tier 2. So that's going to be a significant issue.
Yeah, so great to be looking down the line with this bill. Should we move quickly to the spending bill that was just passed?
Happy to. So, Heather, this is a unique bill, and it is Senate 2789. And this is not a bond bill. It's actually a spending bill of cash that we have. And the unique thing about it is everything in this bill, we hope, will be reimbursed by the federal government. And so we're authorizing these expenditures, again, using cash, not borrowing, in the hope that the federal government will reimburse, if not all, mostly all of the things that are in the bill. And so that bill is, again, I've got to check my notes here, Heather. It's about $1.1 billion. I want to get it right. And it's for a whole host of things related to COVID-19. So some of those things you can naturally think of would be like personal protective equipment. There's $350 million in the bill for that. There is money for nursing homes, money for healthcare facilities, just a whole host of things across the board. And at a policy level, one of the things that I did with this bill was add money to try to ensure that folks that are tested positive with COVID-19 do not go into a nursing home facility that is not equipped to accept them. Because one of the things that we've seen with the COVID-19 pandemic is how devastating it's been to residents of nursing homes. And so I think we've seen, not only from the Massachusetts experience, but the experience around the country, that having folks that test positive go into nursing homes is not a good idea. And so one of the things that I feel particularly strongly about is that we should spend money to make sure that folks with COVID-19 are either A, not going into a nursing home in the first place and going to maybe a specialized facility that we would set up, and there have been some of those, or two, if they are going into a nursing home, they're going into a specialty unit with complete isolation. And so that did get accepted. And so hopefully there'll be resources if the bill does make it to the governor's desk in its current form for that. And along those same lines, we've had some experience with nursing homes in Rockport and Gloucester and in Wilmington, where we've had some pretty significant numbers of people affected by COVID-19. And so I amended the bill to provide approximately $30,000 for each of those communities to recognize the extra expense that they've incurred by responding to the needs of those nursing homes. And I'm very pleased that we were able to do that.
That is really important because those communities have been so hurt, and particularly here. Is there anything else you want to say about the supplemental spending bill?
Well, I just would say that I was also very pleased to work on something that Representative Ferranti also put some money in the bill for, in the House version of the bill, and that is about $110,000 for the open door food pantry, because we know the extra challenges that those folks have had. Julie LaFontaine, who leads the food pantry, has done an outstanding job. She is ever resourceful and has found ways to adopt and adapt to the situation, but we want to provide some additional funding for them as well.
I like to say the Open Door is my favorite food story, and it's really the only food story, right?
I understand.
So I did want to ask you if you're all done with the supplemental.
I am.
I had seen that there was legislation being discussed, and I know you need to go soon, about legislation to prevent COVID-19 deaths in senior facilities. Do you know anything about that legislation?
Well, there's a couple of different pieces on this subject, and the idea here is to try to, again, provide isolation, and also to try to provide oversight, and to try to make sure that the nursing facilities have the resources that they need to be able to confront the threat of COVID-19. And I've talked with a lot of operators of nursing homes, and they certainly have had a lot to do to try to address this, but we need to make sure that they have things like personal protective equipment and sanitizers and other things. And, you know, perhaps sometimes this is an overused cliche, but I'm going to use it anyway. The COVID-19 virus has been a real stress test for nursing homes that were already struggling. The rates of reimbursement from Medicaid and Medicare do not cover the cost of caring for patients. There are fewer and fewer private pay patients. And so, you know, there used to be a time when the private pay patients were paying a premium, and that somewhat helped to cover the overall cost of the facility. That is less and less the case now. And I do believe that we are going to see, it's still a little bit unclear, a ballot question on this subject more generally. As we looked this week, they had to get some additional signatures. I think they needed 13,000, and it was unclear whether or not the proponents of the question got them, but it seems like they were moving in that direction. And so this may be the subject of a much larger public discussion as the election approaches.
And an important discussion. Do you have time for one more question? I know.
Sure.
So along the lines, I think in that there's a discussion about testing more in these senior facilities. And that brings up the question of testing. I know the governor is really trying to accelerate testing in this state. He's trying to get the numbers up to like 45,000 people a day being tested by the end of July. In June, it was still 10,000 a day. Are there enough tests to do this? And tests are very expensive. I know my husband was tested. It cost $180 for his test. And he's a doctor and he needed to be tested because he thought he was exposed. So $180 a test is super expensive. And I had heard that when the testing started, they were $15 a test. So there's something going on here. What is protecting the consumer? Is anybody protecting the consumer? And the insurance companies, you know, they're going to have to pay for so much of this. So can you do you have a response to that?
So the real question here is not whether I have time for the question, it's whether you have time for the answer. So this is a really serious subject. And one of the things that I've been proudest of Massachusetts is that we have been leading the country in the availability of testing and the amount of testing that we've been doing. And I often say that there are two really important tools as we look to the future and trying to get to somewhat of a new normal is the term that's often used. One is contact tracing, and the second is testing. And in Massachusetts, we've been leading the way in both of those things. Now, when it comes to tests, I would argue that we still do not have enough test kits available. And one of the interesting things that we've been working on in the Senate Supply Chain Working Group is not just the test itself, but actually the swabs that are needed to conduct the test. And so we've had to look all around the country to source those swabs. And I think we are in a much better position now because of the sourcing that we've done. So having the test available is one thing, and the cost of the test is another. Now, one of the things that I think we may have touched on in an earlier interview, Heather, is that in Massachusetts, we had a price gouging law that only related to petroleum products. And it was a regulation, and it was put in place in the 1970s when we had the gas crisis that affected the whole country. So at the outset of the pandemic, the Attorney General adopted some emergency regulations relative to price gouging for things that we need during a public health emergency. And I think she may have even said in her language, a public emergency. And so those rules now are being tested, and we're certainly trying to work through them. But almost immediately after she promulgated the rules, I filed a bill to make sure we had a law on the books about price gouging. And that law, that proposal, went to the Committee on Licensure and Professional Regulation, and they reported the bill favorably, and it's now in the Senate Committee on Ways and Means. So this is a subject that we're particularly concerned with, and in fact, I became even more concerned after talking to Steve Walsh, who's the Executive Director of the Massachusetts Hospital Association, about the tremendous anxiety hospitals have about being able to get things like personal protective equipment and tests on a going forward basis. So my impression is that the regulations that the Attorney General adopted were a huge and incredibly positive step in the right direction. We are now moving to make something similar the law in Massachusetts, and yet we haven't done that yet. So we've got work to do, but it's certainly something that we're aware of and something that we're trying to take action on. Now, we also have to recognize that with the constraints of COVID-19, things are going to be more expensive if they need to be transported a longer distance or the cost of labor is increased. And I've had questions about that. We're not trying to ignore those factors, but we are trying to make sure that when you take those factors into account, people are still charging a reasonable price.
Exactly. Well, thank you so much for that. And please keep us posted on this law and how it proceeds, or the bill.
I would be happy to. And, you know, I'm not going to leave this broadcast without congratulating you on that incredible flag that hangs over your head in the background. That is fantastic.
Thank you so much. And as our viewers don't know yet, and they probably don't have time to count if they can't see, there are only 48 stars there. So I'm sorry, Alaska and Hawaii, but it's a nice flag that I found in Pigeon Cove.
Well, it's part of our nation's history and should be recognized for that too.
Exactly. Well, and you have a nice 4th of July weekend. Our viewers won't be watching this until after the 4th of July, but we hope everybody has a great 4th of July weekend. And And thanks for all you're doing.
Well, thanks, Heather. And I'll say sort of retroactively, I hope by the time you're watching this, you've had a wonderful 4th of July weekend for everyone who will be watching. And I want to say that I hope that we will all have taken a little bit of time over the 4th of July weekend to think about the incredible country we live in and all of the freedoms and all of the principles that make us the greatest nation on the face of this earth. But we'll remember that the stewardship of that nation is now in our hands. And we need to think about how together we're going to write the next chapters of the history of this country, making sure that we are true to the founding principles of equality and justice and liberty for all. And I hope that we'll think about that just a little bit and continue to think about it even after the 4th of July weekend.
So I also got to show off my 48-star American flag. That was kind of fun. But I also want to point out when the senator was talking about speaking with an Essex farmer about carbon sequestration, that was Noah Kellerman at Alprilla Farms. He's a great farmer. He's a great friend to the agricultural community on Cape Ann, and I just wanted to put that little plug in.
Well, great work as always. Enjoy your Tuesday, Heather, and we'll see all of you first thing tomorrow.